Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Skillshare. So I probably don't have to tell you that Steve Ditko passed away recently. The Spider-Man and Doctor Strange co-creator had been living a pretty reclusive life for decades now, always intensely private and never really granting an interview to anyone. But his personality did show up very clearly in his work, with his time at Marvel producing some of the most striking and honestly weirdest art that comics have ever seen. But today I want to hone in on one part of his legacy, Spider-Man's villains. Because as the current writer of Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man said on Twitter, it's been almost 60 years and nobody was able to top his original creations. We just keep going back to them because we could never be as weird and cool and timeless. But what is it about his great Spidey villains that had readers, and eventually filmgoers, coming back for more over and over again?
Good eye myself.
So what makes a great Spider-Man villain? What separates Doc Ock or the Green Goblin from, say, Big Wheel or one of the other forgettable adversaries introduced through the years? Well, to see what makes a supervillain work, I think you have to take a look at the hero first. Because bad guys that stick around for the long haul tend to reflect on the superhero's personality in an interesting way. And there tends to be a common through line. Spider-Man's a good example of this. We all know what the core themes of the character are: power and
great responsibility.
Not only is Peter a smart guy, he was also accidentally blessed, or cursed depending on your point of view, with amazing abilities. The same can be said of many of his villains. Both the guys I mentioned earlier, Doc Ock and the Green Goblin, are known for being very intelligent men. One's a scientific genius and the other's a business genius, who's, also no slouch at the science stuff himself. But what do they do with that? That talent, wealth, and yes, power. Unlike Peter, they never use it responsibly. This might be best summed up in a more recent famous panel, where a villain says that, yeah, he could cure cancer, but he really wants to turn people into dinosaurs. The Green Goblin's goals aren't usually so ridiculous, but in many ways his motives are similar. Instead of using great power in any productive way like Spider-Man tries to, he only uses it to cause death and destruction. But that's not the only thing that sets Ditko's classic villains apart, and what made his art so different from that of other Marvel legend Jack Kirby, where Kirby drew confident and larger-than-life characters, both in his heroes and his villains. Ditko's creations, more often than not, were skinny, angry, and neurotic. Compare his Peter Parker to that of the artist that followed him, John Romita. Ditko's Peter almost always does the right thing, sure, but he's also just much less traditionally heroic than many future versions of Spidey. He's bitter, constantly anxious, and surprisingly angry. This sense of angst really set the book apart from most other comics at the time, that were filled with square-jawed, no-nonsense heroes. To be fair, John Romita's interpretation of Spider-Man is iconic in its own right, but it also shaved a lot of those rough edges off of Peter. And Ditko took this same approach to villains. Spider-Man's best bad guys are usually pretty far from the evil and meticulous Doctor Doom. They're much more in line with, say, the Vulture, insecure, bitter, and at times at the edge of sanity. While the Fantastic Four fought giant monsters and evil dictators, Spider-Man tends to fight a lot of really angry middle-aged men who feel like they've been screwed over. Like Peter, they find themselves with a lot of power and a lot of problems, but thanks to Uncle Ben, only Peter uses his responsibly.
Say, where have I seen that guy before?
But what about later Spider-Man villains, you might be asking? The ones introduced well after Ditko left. Well, let's take a look at the most famous one, Venom. Sure, in terms of design and aesthetics, he looks nothing like a Ditko character. Venom definitely looks like a character from the 80s, not the 60s. But look a little closer, and I think you'll find a ton of similarities to the old school classics. For one thing, Eddie Brock is almost completely driven by insecurity, anger at Peter Parker, and a profound bitterness that his work is being overlooked. He's offered a lot of power, and then immediately uses it in the worst way possible. So I think part of the reason he's stuck around so much, aside from the fact that, he just looks cool on a t-shirt, is that his story taps into those classic Spider-Man themes. I think this is a huge part of why Spider-Man has one of the strongest rogues galleries in comics. Because, and I mean this in the best way possible, they're kind of sad. In a way, they're a lot more human and grounded than most supervillains. Many of them share Peter's love of science and are even better scientists than him. They also have a similar chip on their shoulder. A lot of them feel misunderstood by the world, who they feel like have failed to respect their hard work and intellect. Now, Peter Parker doesn't take it to such self-pitying extremes, but there's no denying that that's also a part of his character, especially in the Ditko days.
Once I unlock the secrets in this book, I'll have supernatural power.
As future writers and artists, both in comics and other mediums like video games and movies, wrote the character, Peter Parker would lighten up a little, start dressing more casually, and even in some interpretations look more like a running back than Steve Ditko's nerdy science enthusiast. But one thing that was never lost is what Ditko brought to those villains. That small-scale sense of bitterness, self-pity, and isolation that most of Spider-Man's rogues gallery suffer from make them the perfect fodder for a character who shares a lot of those traits as well. But of course, what makes Peter different is that he doesn't give in to those traits or use them as an excuse to, do supervillain stuff. He goes out and does the right thing anyway, which has made him really likable and easy to identify with for generations of fans. Characters like Doc Ock, Mysterio, the Vulture, and the Green Goblin probably aren't going to be thought of as like really cool badasses. There's a lot less Doc Ock merchandise out there than, say, Carnage merch, and I understand why. But I think that these early villains are exactly what a Spider-Man bad guy should be, in that they don't just serve their roles as a plot device, doing the dastardly thing Spidey needs to stop, they also contrast really well with him, and give the reader more insight into Peter Parker. So how do you create a good Spider-Man villain? Well, in my opinion at least, you find a facet of Peter Parker's personality, and then you come up with a character who can hold a mirror up to it, and make the reader look at him in a different light. And to this day, I don't think any of them have done that quite as well as the original 60s villains. So remembering the past achievements of comic creators is super important to me, but equally important I think is looking to the future. It's no secret that the comic book industry needs some fresh voices, and I think those could really come from anywhere. If you're interested in getting into comic creation, and I'm not gonna lie, I've definitely tried my hand at it in the past, I can't recommend Jeffrey Jacobs' course, Prepare Your Comic, Manga, or Graphic Novel for Print, highly enough. I love that there's absolutely no time wasted in this course. You jump right in and learn a ton about the craft of creating and publishing comics. And I definitely knew a lot more about the industry when I finished it. But if you're more of an artist or an inker, there's tons of courses on here for you as well. I've had Skillshare on as a sponsor before, talking about how they have over 20,000 courses in writing, film production, technology, and a bunch more. But I don't think I've talked about just how great they are if you're looking to break into comics, since they're basically a one-stop shop for learning about comic book creation. So to support the channel and get 2 months of unlimited access to all those courses, go to skl.sh/CaptainMidnight3. Again, that's unlimited access, giving you a ton of time to soak up as much graphic novel or webcomic knowledge as you want for free. And you can only get that at skl.sh/CaptainMidnight3.